Welcome to the video series for the book, So the Next Generation Will Know. We are honored to be on this series with you, to be going through this journey, really taking a look at what this next generation believes and some practical strategies how we can minister to them. And I think you'd agree with us that this generation faces probably more challenges just one click away than any previous generation. So this is really a challenge to you and to the church to say it's time to really focus on reaching young people today. As we look at this book, one of the ways we want to frame it was how do we lovingly respond to this generation? And a story that I'll never forget that happened with me, Jim, is I was probably 2 or 3 years ago, I was sitting in Starbucks with my son, who was maybe 3 years old at the time. It was in the morning, and I just pulled him out of kind of his preschool, whatever it was, and we were just sitting there talking. And a fellow just leaned over and kind of interrupted us. He's probably 10 years older than I am. And he goes, "You know what? Good for you." And I kind of paused. I'm like, "What do you mean?" He goes, "You know what? My kids are out of the house. And I sacrificed a ton of money." And if I remember correctly, he's like, it was hundreds of thousands of dollars to spend time with my kids. And he paused. He said, "I wouldn't change a minute of it." And I sat there and I thought, wow, we sacrifice for what we love. And it got me really looking at my life because I teach, because I speak, in many ways pastor this generation and my own kids. Like, how am I really sacrificing for this generation? Now, you have a remarkable story that I think that I would love to hear of your kind of efforts to reach out as a pastor. You're obviously a parent. You've been speaking to a ton of students for years, but kind of an approach you took that opened your eyes up to how we need to respond and minister to this generation.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about sacrifice. I mean, it doesn't even have to be $100,000 or thousands of dollars. I mean, we do this all the time, right? When we make choices about, well, where are we going to go to dinner tonight? You're not choosing what you and your wife probably want to do. You're probably choosing that choice that works for your kids. And what movie are you going to watch? Well, you're choosing the choice that works for your kids. And what vacation are you going to take? You're choosing the choice that works for your kids. Well, now it's time for us as a church family to make a decision about, do we love our kids in the church enough to make these kinds of sacrificial choices that are for the kids? As a youth pastor, I was working full-time as a detective, and I was bivocational, and I was a youth pastor, and I had a background in the arts before I became a detective. So my first approach to youth pastoring was fully intentional about the arts: music, visual imagery, experience. I really wanted to have a robust artistic experience every Sunday. And I will tell you that was pretty lame. It didn't really accomplish what I was hoping it would accomplish. As a matter of fact, after the end of the first year, the seniors who graduated, the vast majority walked away from the church.
Wow.
And
within a year,
before Thanksgiving break of their freshman year in college, I was hearing from the other kids in our ministry that, Danny's no longer a Christian. He's at Berkeley, or he's at Sonoma State, or wherever they were. And so I realized this approach I'm taking, which is centered on experience, I think in some ways it was very powerful, but clearly it wasn't the kind of approach that would help our kids. And I think you know this too. We've been watching the data for a number of years. We've seen, I think, the trajectory of what's happening with young people in the church. And you're probably as familiar as anybody with the actual data.
Well, you and I have been probably charting dozens of studies, as much as anybody, trying to find out what's really happening with this generation. And I think there's two mistakes people make. There's kind of an alarmist response that says, all kids are leaving the church, the sky is falling. And I think that's a mistake. On the flip side, there's also some voices you and I interacted with just online saying kids aren't disengaged in the church. It doesn't matter. And I think that's someone who sees one vibrant ministry or one vibrant family and makes an assessment on that. I think the studies are pretty clear, and you and I could cite them. And we cite these in the book specifically, that there's a specific number of kids, not all disengaged in their faith. We hear about the nuns, Nones,
Yes.
and everyone thinks they're all atheists, agnostics. That's not necessarily true. Some read the Bible, some believe in God, some pray, but there's a significant disengagement from the church. And I would say studies probably range from about 40% to 70%. There's just studies that will look at different ages, they'll look at different groups. Right. So it's a little more broad than we would like. But even 40% is concerning.
That's right.
70% is huge.
Yeah.
The pushback I'll hear is people say, well, people always left in the high school, college age years, young adults. They come back when they have kids. But the problem is many people are not having kids. Many people are pushing back when they get married. And some of the signs are that this generation's not coming back like in the past. So to me, it's like, we better take this seriously without being alarmist. But I think our approach is, let's be intentional and let's be realistic.
Yeah, I don't think we should be overreacting to this, and we shouldn't be alarmist because we're trying to bang this bell so you'll pay attention. No, I think what we're saying is, we see in culture, in our nation, that the number of self-identifying Christians is clearly dropping every year.
That's right.
And the group that's dropping ahead of all the other groups are this group of young people in their high school and college years. So the question is, how do we respond to it? And if you look at what they're telling us, what are the barriers to belief? What are the reasons why you don't want to be involved in church anymore?
And by the way, you and I aren't just looking at this saying, this 30,000 foot cultural view. I care about all this generation, but I think of my kids, Scotty.
That's right.
Shauna.
That's right.
And Shane, this is a personal question for me.
Yeah, between the two of us, we have 7 kids that we actually can put faces and names to what we're seeing, and we have a really vested interest in whether they stay in the church.
Honestly, it might sound selfish, but I wrote this book first because I wanted to articulate, I wanted to research, I want to think about, how do I minister to my own kids well? Now that brings us to the point you were making about, what are the barriers that are really keeping kids from staying in the faith or trusting the Lord? Right. You have a lot of experience.
Well, and we've listed some of these in the participants' guide for this session, so I won't go into all of them in detail, but clearly they break into 2 large categories. The lion's share are really skeptical questions they don't feel were well answered. Questions about how to integrate this idea of science and faith. Questions about how is just unreasonable. Any miracle, for example, unreasonable. They are skeptical questions. They're really good rational questions they have that they don't feel were well answered. Those are the lion's share, and we've listed some of those in the participant's guide. But also, there's a large number of these where they are just relational. They've had a bad experience with someone in the church. So that kind of, I think, gives us a way to launch into how we might address some of this. Now, let's talk about that for a second. Practical ways to address it.
I think that balance is vital, because a lot of kids will say, I leave the faith for intellectual reasons, because it can sound more sophisticated than saying, I was offended, I want to sleep with my girlfriend, I had a bad experience with a Christian. So I think people sometimes dismiss intellectual issues and say it's just relational. Some people say relational doesn't matter, it's just truth.
That's not,
We frame this book about a loving response. Love speaks the truth.
Yes.
We have to give both. Now, one of the largest studies that we cite in the book, I think is remarkable, by a fellow by the name of Vernon Bankston at USC, 4 generations, 3,500 people. Think about that, 35 years. The number one statistical factor to why a kid would stay in the faith is a warm relationship with the Father.
That's right.
What breaks it was divorce and other positive things with grandparents. So relationships are huge, but we can't dismiss the intellectual component.
That's right.
What are a couple principles that we should keep in mind as we approach this dynamic today?
Well, we've listed some of these in the participant's guide also, but what I want to just talk about is 2 really briefly, and then I'll ask you for a couple too. But the 2 that strike me is we got to start early. Because that age, I was with your dad, Josh McDowell, at a conference. How is it that he gets involved in all of our ministries, even when he's not here? But he does.
I don't know, but you brought it up first.
I know, I should have brought it up. Okay, but we were talking about how the age of skepticism has dropped from 18 to about 12, 13. It's because the first now skeptic they're encountering, it happens to be online, and that's available to them in that glowing rectangle at the end of their hand. So I think we have to address these issues at a much earlier rate. And we have to, I'm with you, a lot of times young people will tell us that their objections are skeptical, they're rational, they're areas of rational doubt, when in fact they're masquerading something else. But as a parent, I want to address those skeptical questions early, so I can take away what might just be a kind of a lame excuse later.
Yes.
And I at least want to take away the excuses our young people will offer, so they can know, I can say that, but there's already a good response to that. And so they can really see where their objections lie. They may not be as rational as they think they are.
Right.
So I think we have to address, number one, start early, and don't be afraid to look at those skeptical questions that even scare us, because we're not quite sure how to respond to the problem of evil, how to answer questions about sexuality, about why should we trust the reliability of the Scripture. These are the questions young people have. We have to start answering those questions early. But beyond that, I think you and I know, you said it, it's about other relational issues that we have to take those approaches as well. So talk about some of those.
Well, one thing to keep in mind is we want to release you of is you don't have to be the expert and have all the answers. If in a relationship you're willing to open up the conversation and employ some of the strategies we're going to get to throughout this book, you can make a huge difference. This is a generation that values authenticity. So just being real with this generation can help build some of those bridges. Our challenge in this session as we're kicking off the series is just to encourage you to be intentional. This isn't somebody else's issue. This is an issue in the church. And some of the most heartbreaking conversations we have is when parents come up to us and say, my kids aren't following the Lord. The first thing I want to do is release them and say, you know what? Don't blame yourself. God gives you grace. Kids aren't bricks that you just insert A, you get B. But I also want to say to other parents, look, don't be those parents who learn this later or those teachers. Let's start now. Let's start early because this generation is ready to respond. Looking forward to being in the next session with you. We're going to look at some unique just kind of data and statistics and analysis to understand what's unique about this new generation, which is known as Gen Z. We'll see you then.